The can still looks innocent. Red on top. White on the bottom. A metal pressed into the label more than a century ago and never really removed. It sits in pantries, on grocery shelves, in school kitchens, in church basements, in the American memory itself. Campbell's built that familiarity deliberately. The red and white design dates to 1898, after a company executive borrowed the color scheme from a Cornell football uniform, and the medallion came after the company won a bronze medal for product excellence at the Paris Exposition of 1900. Long before most American brands learned how to look permanent, Campbell's had already done it. But permanence is the most dangerous promise an American dynasty can make. Behind that label was not just a food company, but a fortune, a bloodline, and a long habit of treating control as if it could solve everything. It began with a chemist, John Thompson Dorrance, who came into the company in 1897 for $7.50 a week and helped turn condensed soup into one of the most profitable ideas in American business. It did not end with soup. It ended in courtrooms, in inheritance fights, in a family learning that wealth can become a trap as easily as a shield. When Dorrance died in 1930, Pennsylvania and New Jersey each claimed him as their own and each taxed his estate, producing one of the most infamous double tax fights in American legal history. And the damage did not stop at the grave. What one generation tried to protect with paperwork, the next would inherit as pressure. What looked like security hardened into obligation. What looked like a family empire became, over time, a family burden. Decades later, one of Dorrance's grandsons, John T. Dorrance III, became an Irish citizen and later sold hundreds of millions of dollars in Campbell's stock after the family's tax history had already become legend. Reports about him have long tied that move to the punishing logic of the American tax code, a logic that had already scarred the family once before, and that still hovered over fortunes too large to divide cleanly. Facing crushing tax disputes and corporate turmoil, one of the heirs tied to Campbell's would eventually walk away from the company and from the country itself, exposing how fiscal pressure and mismanagement can hollow out an American icon and ruin lives. So this is not really a story about soup, not in the small sense. It is a story about what happens when an invention becomes an empire, when an empire becomes a fortune, and when that fortune starts ordering the lives of the people born inside it. How does a brand that learned to last so well produce a family that kept trying to escape the cost of lasting? To answer that, we have to go back before the lawsuits, before the embassy in Dublin, before the tax bill that outlived the man who triggered it, to the factory floor in Camden and the young chemist who thought the problem with soup was water. I'm checking a few precise early history details first: Dorrance's education, his salary, the condensed soup breakthrough, the label change, and the early scale-up, so the chapter can stay vivid without drifting into legend. The chemist who removed the water. The empire began with a problem so ordinary most people would have missed it. Soup was too heavy. Not too weak. Not too bland. Too heavy. In the late 19th century, Campbell was still a modest preserved food company in Camden, selling tomatoes, vegetables, jellies, and minced meat into a world where canned soup existed, but not in a form that could conquer an entire country. The first ready-to-eat soup the company introduced was beefsteak tomato in 1895. It was respectable. It was saleable. Nothing about it yet suggested a national habit, much less a dynasty. Into that modest business walked John Thompson Dorrance, 24 years old, armed with an education that looked almost excessive for a canning factory. Campbell's own history says he arrived in 1897 with a degree from MIT and a doctorate from the University of Göttingen. MIT adds another useful detail: he had spent time in famous restaurants in Paris, studying the mechanics of soup not as comfort food, but as chemistry, process, and cost. He could have taken a safer road. Instead, he went to his uncle's company and accepted a nominal wage, paying for his own laboratory equipment under the unusual terms of his employment. The gesture mattered. It did not look like inheritance yet. It looked like conviction. What Dorrance saw was brutally simple. Soup was mostly water, and water was eating the business alive. It made every can larger than it needed to be, every shipment heavier than it should have been, every shelf more expensive than the customer could see. MIT's history of the breakthrough puts the arithmetic cleanly. By removing the heaviest ingredient, Dorrance could slash the price of a can from more than 30 cents to 10. That was not merely a food innovation. It was a logistics revolution disguised as lunch. He did not invent hunger, comfort, or the American kitchen. He found the waste inside a familiar product and cut it out with scientific precision. That is why the breakthrough matters so much. Condensed soup did not win because it was romantic. It won because it obeyed the hardest rule in consumer America: make the product easier to move, easier to store, and cheaper to buy without making it feel cheaper to use. Campbell's official history dates the condensing process to 1897. Harvard Business School dates the invention itself to 1899 and credits it with cutting canning and shipping costs by roughly 2/3. Either way, the effect was immediate and enormous. What had been a regional preserved food business was suddenly holding the kind of idea that can scale faster than the people around it fully understand. The can changed with the product, and the image changed with the can. Campbell says the familiar red and white label appeared in 1898 after a company executive returned from the annual Cornell Penn football game impressed by Cornell's uniforms. 2 years later, the company won a bronze medal for product excellence at the Paris Exposition and placed the medallion on the label, where it still sits. Those choices can look decorative, in retrospect, almost accidental. They were not. The company had discovered something rare, a cheaper product with a richer identity. Success moved quickly after that. Harvard Business School notes that within 5 years Campbell was selling 16 million cans of soup a year, and Campbell's own history says the company achieved national distribution by 1911. Those are not just growth markers. They reveal the deeper shift taking place under the surface. A company that had sold preserved foods was becoming something narrower, stronger, and far more dangerous. It was learning that focus could be power. Dorrance was not merely improving soup. He was discovering that a single product, executed with enough discipline, could reorganize an entire business around itself. By the time he became president in 1914, the essential logic was already in place. The invention had worked. The label had stuck. The country had responded. Campbell was no longer drifting among preserves and canned goods, hoping one line might carry the rest. A new order had formed in Camden, built on a chemist's refusal to waste weight and a businessman's growing instinct that anything outside the winning formula could be cut away. The rise felt earned because it was. The danger was that a company built on simplification can become hungry for more than efficiency. It can start wanting concentration, control, and ownership in the same ruthless form. That is where the story widens, from invention into empire. 10 cents and total control. A breakthrough becomes dangerous when it stops being a clever idea and starts becoming a governing principle. That is what happened in Camden. Condensed soup had already solved the cost problem. The larger revelation was harder, colder, and far more profitable. One product, executed with enough discipline, could pull an entire company into its orbit and leave everything weaker outside it. Campbell was no longer learning how to make soup cheaper. It was learning how to build power around repetition, uniformity, and scale. The numbers gave Dorrance his proof. Harvard Business School notes that within 5 years of the condensing breakthrough, Campbell was selling 16 million cans of soup a year. That kind of output does more than enrich a business. It changes its identity. A company that once packed preserves and canned goods for a regional trade was becoming a national machine built around a single promise: familiar food, stable quality, low price, endless reproducibility. Soup was no longer one line among many. It was the line that justified the rest of the enterprise, and eventually the line that would make much of the rest look expendable. Dorrance understood that success at that scale punishes distraction. Secondary lines that might have looked sensible in a smaller company began to look like drag. Encyclopedia.com's company history puts it plainly: once he took command, he moved to discontinue marginal lines like preserves, jams, and ketchup so the business could concentrate on soup. That choice mattered because it reveals the deeper logic of his rise. He was not expanding by becoming broader in the usual sense. He was expanding by becoming narrower, sharper, and more ruthless about what counted. Campbell would not win by being a general canning concern with a popular soup division. It would win by becoming the company people thought of when they heard the word soup at all. Image helped harden that strategy into something the country could recognize from a distance. The red and white label had arrived in 1898. The Paris medallion followed in 1900. Campbell's official history adds another piece of the system in 1905. The company's first national advertising campaign began appearing in magazines such as Good Housekeeping. Not long after, the company says, national distribution was achieved in 1911. That sequence matters. Dorrance did not simply invent a cheaper can and wait for the public to discover it. Control widened beyond the label. Campbell's own corporate history shows Dorrance and his wife hosting annual meetings for farmers at their home in Cinnaminson during the 19-teens and 1920s, using company experts to teach crop rotation, water savings, seed selection, and yield improvement. The company later described that investment directly. With condensed soup growing fast, Dorrance recognized that a stable vegetable supply was critical and poured money into agricultural research. That detail is easy to treat as a footnote. It was not. It meant the business was reaching backward from the grocery shelf into the soil itself. Dorrance wanted the tomatoes, the methods, the yields, the timing, and the quality under tighter control. He was not satisfied to sell soup. He wanted to discipline the chain that made soup possible. Ownership tightened in parallel. Campbell's history confirms that Dorrance became president in 1914. Secondary business histories add the harsher, more revealing development that followed. He bought out Arthur Dorrance and the remaining Campbell interests, becoming sole owner in 1915. That same year, Campbell acquired the Franco-American Food Company, its first acquisition, and by 1922 the business had gone so far into its own identity that it formally adopted soup as its middle name. Those moves belonged together. Buy the outside rival. Buy out the inside family? Rename the company around the product. What looks, from a distance, like clean corporate growth was also a steady removal of competing claims. Fewer distractions. Fewer partners. Fewer ambiguities about who controlled the machine and what the machine was for. Seen from the factory floor, it must have looked like order. Seen from inside the balance sheet, it looked even better. A dime could reach farther than a luxury product. A smaller can could travel farther than a heavier one. A narrower company could hit harder than a scattered one. Dorrance had not merely found a formula for soup. He had found a formula for concentration itself, and concentration has a way of making men believe they can master more than markets. By then, the business was no longer just successful. It was becoming personal wealth on a scale large enough to distort where a man lived, what he feared, and how much reality he thought paperwork could rearrange. The profits were rising. The authority was hardening. Before long, the story would need a mansion, a second address, and a fiction expensive enough to outlive its maker. If this story is already changing how you see something as ordinary as a can on a shelf, stay with it. Like the video, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts below. The deeper layers of this story are only just beginning to surface, and they carry consequences few people expect. The house that wasn't a home. For a while, the success looked complete. The cans were everywhere. The company was tighter, richer, and more disciplined than the small Camden concern John Dorrance had entered as a chemist. Wealth had done what wealth always promises to do. It had made the world larger. A man who had built a national food empire could now buy distance, acreage, stone, timber, staff, privacy, and the kind of address that announced arrival before a guest ever reached the front door. That was exactly where the trouble began. In 1925, Dorrance bought Woodcrest in Radnor Township, Pennsylvania, an immense country place originally designed by Horace Trumbauer for a Drexel-connected financier. Sources on the estate describe a 51-room house set on what had once been roughly 238 acres, built in local schist with limestone trim and half-timbered wings, the sort of main-line property that made success look hereditary even when it was newly made. After the purchase, the Dorrances stripped out the darker late Victorian interiors and brightened the great rooms into something more in keeping with their own idea of position. The move mattered because it was not a retreat. It was a declaration. A man who had sold soup for a dime had bought himself into the architectural language of old money. The family lived there as families live in the place that is actually home. The children went to school from there. Social life radiated from there. Household life scaled to it. Time, covering the tax fight after Dorrance's death, noted that Pennsylvania argued Woodcrest was his real home from the moment he acquired it in 1925, while the executors insisted the Pennsylvania estate existed mainly to give his 5 children social and educational advantages. That defense tells you almost everything. People do not build their children's social world, schooling, and daily rhythm around a fiction unless the fiction is serving some other purpose. That other purpose sat across the river in New Jersey. Dorrance still had his older place in Cinnaminson, near the factory and the research farms, and he treated it not as the center of family life, but as a legal shield. When the later tax litigation summarized the facts, the picture was almost absurd in its clarity. Dorrance maintained 3 establishments in his final years, one in New Jersey, one in Pennsylvania, and one in Bar Harbor, Maine. He declared himself in his will to be a resident of Cinnaminson, required his executors under severe penalties to probate the will there, and kept the paperwork pointed toward New Jersey even as the center of daily life had plainly shifted. It was a meticulous performance. The problem with performances is that they have to survive contact with evidence. The evidence was not dramatic. That made it stronger. The record later cited facts that sounded almost petty until you understood what they meant. Before the move to Woodcrest, Dorrance employed 10 servants at Cinnaminson. After 1925, there were never more than 4, and after the death of his mother in 1929 only 2 remained. Time, reporting from the Pennsylvania proceedings, highlighted one devastating detail from cross-examination. The gas and electric bill at Cinnaminson for a month came to $7. A man can sign documents, keep bank accounts, maintain voter registration, and declare a domicile on paper. A nearly empty house tells on him anyway. Empty service rosters tell on him. Utility bills tell on him. Routine tells on him. What makes the whole arrangement more revealing is that it fit Dorrance's temperament almost perfectly. He had built his career by removing waste, reducing volume, stripping away what did not need to be there. Yet once the fortune became enormous enough to threaten him with taxation, simplicity gave way to theater. The old Jersey property remained standing as a legal prop. The will reinforced the illusion. The family's real life flowed elsewhere. Underneath it all sat a basic calculation: if Pennsylvania could be avoided, the estate might be spared a punishing inheritance hit. That instinct was understandable. It was also dangerous, because it relied on a belief men of great success often develop without noticing it, that a reality inconvenient to the balance sheet can be managed into non-existence if the paperwork is disciplined enough. By then, the company was already rich enough to attract every kind of attention Dorrance disliked. Time noted that investment bankers had long dreamed of taking the enterprise public and never managed to talk him into it. He wanted no dilution, no outside power, no forced transparency. The house arrangement belongs inside that same pattern. Control had worked so often in business that he began extending it into mortality itself. Own the product. Own the company. Own the stock. Own the legal identity. Own the terms on which the state encounters your death. That is a formidable way to live. It is also a fragile one, because the whole structure depends on the next tribunal accepting the story you have told about yourself. Nothing had exploded yet. No court had ruled. No tax assessment had arrived. On the surface, this was still a success story decorated with acreage and servants, and careful legal housekeeping. Underneath, the line between prudence and deception had already started to narrow. Dorrance had built a second home for the purpose of proving he still lived in the first. He had taken the clean logic that made him rich and pressed it into a part of life where logic does not always obey the man holding it. One hard attack would be enough to test the fiction. When it came, 2 states would be waiting. Death and the double claim. He died in the wrong house for the story he had spent years trying to tell. John Thompson Dorrance had built Woodcrest into the real center of family life, kept Cinnaminson alive as a legal shield, and trusted that paper, routine, and discipline would hold the line when the line finally mattered. Then September of 1930 arrived. According to the later federal opinion, he had spent part of that final summer at Bar Harbor, returned east, and died at the New Jersey residence while the Pennsylvania house was being made ready for occupancy. Even in death, the arrangement looked managed. Within days, it began to come apart. His executors did exactly what he had ordered them to do. The will declared him a resident of Cinnaminson Township, Burlington County, New Jersey, and required, under severe penalties for disobedience, that the document be offered for probate there. It was. New Jersey moved as if the matter were obvious. His intangible property was there, the estate was being administered there, and the state could tax accordingly. Pennsylvania saw the same death, and drew the opposite conclusion. In its view, Woodcrest was not a country convenience, or a social platform for the children. It was home. The legal conflict that followed was not some side quarrel at the margins of a rich man's estate. It was a direct collision between two states over the situs of one of the largest fortunes in America. Pennsylvania struck first, and struck hard. The federal opinion recounts that the Register of Wills in Delaware County appointed an appraiser who, in April of 1931, valued the estate at $199,999,000 and assessed an inheritance tax of $31,465,200. The executors appealed and initially won in the Orphans' Court. That victory did not last. In September of 1932, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania reversed the lower ruling and reinstated the tax in modified form, holding that the evidence of life in Radnor outweighed the declarations attached to New Jersey. On paper, Dorrance had guarded his domicile. In practice, Pennsylvania treated his paperwork as camouflage. The reasoning was devastating because it cut through the entire performance. The Pennsylvania courts looked past the will, the official statements, the formal address, and asked the older, simpler question: where did the man actually live? There was the great house in Radnor. There were the servants, the children's lives, the social world, the daily pattern. Paper could announce intention. Conduct could expose reality. After the Pennsylvania judgment, the executors paid more than $14 million to the Commonwealth, along with interest, and posted a $4 million bond against additional amounts that might later come due. It was already a ruinous result. It still was not the end. New Jersey refused to step aside. That was the real trap. The same federal opinion explains that New Jersey assessed its own inheritance tax on the estate in the amount of $12,247,333.52, based on a reported estate value of roughly $115 million and on the executor's own filings identifying Dorrance as domiciled there. Pennsylvania had already said he belonged to Radnor. New Jersey answered that each state had the authority to determine domicile for itself. The executors argued that a man could not be taxed twice for the privilege of dying. The courts were not persuaded. By the middle of the decade, Dorrance had become a legal absurdity of the most expensive kind, domiciled in Pennsylvania for one sovereign purpose and in New Jersey for another. What makes the story sting is not just the money, though the money was staggering. It is the symmetry of the failure. Dorrance had made his name by removing what was unnecessary. Water from soup. Waste from freight. Distraction from the product line. Partners from the ownership structure. Yet in the one area where clarity mattered most, he added complexity for no productive reason at all. He maintained a second identity in law to defend a first identity in life, and the legal fiction multiplied the cost it was supposed to reduce. The old formula had broken. Simplification had made him rich. Evasion made the estate vulnerable. The damage outlived the litigation because it altered the family's imagination of wealth. Campbell stock was no longer just the source of power. It was a future tax problem waiting inside every generation. The fortune had become harder to admire cleanly. It came loaded with warning, memory, and fear. Dorrance had built one of the most disciplined companies in the country, then left behind one of the most expensive lessons in American inheritance law. His heirs did not merely inherit the money. They inherited the bill, the scar, and the instinct to keep control even tighter the next time. That instinct would soon be written into a document long enough and stern enough to govern children, grandchildren, and people not yet born. The will that locked the future. The tax fight had already proved one thing with brutal clarity. John Thompson Dorrance did not trust the world to leave his fortune alone after he was gone. The will proved something harsher. He did not trust his own family to leave it alone either. When the document was opened, it ran to 35 pages. Time reported the broad terms in October of 1930, 1/4 to his widow, Ethel Malincrot Dorrance, 1/4 to his only son, John Thompson Dorrance Jr., then 11 years old, 1/8 to each of his 4 daughters. On paper, that looked like division. In practice, it was command. The personal bequests tell you how carefully he thought about the symbolism of inheritance. Time noted that the boy did not just receive 1/4 of the estate. He received the father's library, with instructions that it remain intact until he reached 50, and the grandfather clock besides. That is not the language of loose wealth. It is the language of transmission, of authority packaged as property, of a man trying to reach beyond death and still arrange the room after he has left it. Even the objects were chosen to suggest continuity, patience, order, masculine succession. The fortune was being split. The idea of the dynasty was being staged. The real center of the will, though, was neither the furniture nor the fractions. It was the stock. Time captured the essential instruction plainly. Dorrance urged his executors not to sell Campbell's soup stock, and if a sale ever became necessary, it was to come only after the greatest deliberation, with the shares sold in one block rather than scattered piecemeal. That detail is everything. He had spent years buying control, consolidating authority, and keeping outsiders away from the company. Death was not going to make him abandon that project willingly. The will turned ownership into an ethic: hold the stock, preserve the block, do not let the company leak away one transaction at a time. A great many fortunes are divided by death. Dorrance's was engineered to resist division even while it was being distributed. There was another hard edge under the legal craft. Later reporting on the family's history pointed to an important difference between Pennsylvania and New Jersey law that helps explain why Dorrance fought so stubbornly to keep his domicile in New Jersey. Under Pennsylvania law, his widow would have been entitled to 1/3 of his personal property. New Jersey offered no such protection. The same reporting says he even had Ethel sign a statement affirming that their legal residence was New Jersey. Read that alongside the will and the pattern sharpens. He was not merely trying to lower taxes. He was trying to narrow claims. He wanted the state, the spouse, and eventually the heirs themselves to receive only what he had decided they should receive. The domicile fiction had failed him in court. The controlling instinct behind it survived intact in the will. That is what gives the document its peculiar force. It was not a sentimental patriarch's blessing. It was a system. The widow was provided for, but not liberated. The daughters were enriched, but not centered. The son was favored, but also enclosed. The estate was enormous. Time said filing of the will suggested a fortune that might reach $150 million, yet the structure surrounding it was designed to make abundance feel less like freedom than assignment. Money this large usually promises choice. Dorrance used it to reduce choice, not enlarge it. The family would have wealth. What he did not want them to have was easy exit. The emotional cost of that design is easy to miss when looking only at balance sheets. It lands more clearly when you remember who some of these beneficiaries were. Jack, the son who received the library, the clock, and the quarter share, was still a boy. The daughters were inheriting not merely money but a problem already scarred by litigation. The stock they held represented security, prestige, and enormous future value. It also represented concentration risk, family discipline, and the expectation that when pressure came, and it always comes, they would protect the company before they protected comfort. That is how a fortune turns from prize to burden. The legal structure does not simply preserve value. It teaches the descendants what kind of sacrifice the founder considers acceptable. Look closely and the deeper irony becomes hard to miss. The man who had revolutionized food manufacturing by taking water out of soup left behind a document swollen with contingencies, restrictions, warnings, and control mechanisms. Simplicity built the company. Complexity guarded the fortune. The first system created an American icon. The second locked a bloodline into decades of obedience, resentment, and delayed choices. Nothing had broken in the family yet in any public way. The structure still looked formidable. It was also already planting the conditions for future strain. Before long, the boy with the library and the clock would grow into a man rich enough to command the company, yet shaped from the beginning by an inheritance that gave him ownership without anything like freedom. If the weight of this story is starting to settle in, don't let it pass quietly. Like the video, subscribe to follow where this leads, and leave your perspective below. What comes next is not just inheritance or control, but the cost of holding power when the rules begin to tighten. The heir who didn't want the crown. The will had made the boy important long before it made him ready. That is the first thing to understand about John T. Dorrance Jr., known inside the family as Jack. He inherited weight before he inherited authority. The stock was waiting for him. The family name was waiting for him. The expectation was waiting for him. What was not waiting for him was any simple joy in the arrangement. By the time he reached adulthood, Campbell was already a monument built by his father's discipline and guarded by a legal structure his father had written from beyond the grave. Jack did not enter the story as a conqueror. He entered it as a son stepping into a room that had been arranged for him by someone who no longer had to live inside it. His path into the company was slower and more ordinary than the scale of the fortune might lead you to expect. The Los Angeles Times obituary on his death says he joined Campbell in 1946 after several years in the Army during the Second World War, and then spent 16 years working in various departments, including a stint as a floor foreman in the Camden plant. That detail matters because it shows the family did not simply place him on a throne and hand him a gavel. He was moved through the company by stages, learning the business from the floor upward rather than being installed above it from the start. The heir was being taught the machinery, perhaps because the older generation understood that ownership without apprenticeship is one of the fastest ways to ruin both a company and a son. Even so, apprenticeship and ease are not the same thing. Jack was carrying two inheritances at once, and they pointed in different directions. One was financial. He belonged to one of the richest families in American business. The other was psychological. He had not built the thing that made him rich. That distinction sounds small until you place it inside a man's daily life. A founder can confuse the fortune with proof of self. An heir often cannot. By the time Jack rose to the chairmanship in 1962, he was not stepping into empty space. He was stepping into the shadow of the chemist who had invented condensed soup, dominated the company, and then bound the family to it with one of the most controlling wills in American corporate history. That helps explain the shape of his leadership. He did not behave like a man trying to outdo the founder. He behaved more like a custodian of an inheritance too large to handle casually. Encyclopedia.com notes that he retired as chairman in 1984, after which he remained director of the board's executive committee, and that the family still controlled roughly 58% of Campbell's stock. The company was not weak under his watch. It expanded, diversified, and remained safe from takeover. Yet there is a difference between extending a legacy and feeling free inside it. A company can still grow while its central family relationship to that company grows more strained, more dutiful, and more defensive. In that sense, Jack's era feels less like a second founding than a long act of guardianship. He was preserving an empire whose terms had been set by somebody else. That burden became more important as the family itself changed. He had children of his own. They were not raised in Camden factory culture. They were raised at a greater distance from the source of the wealth, closer to the modern American version of dynastic life, where the fortune arrives before the explanation does. The old will still govern the broad outline. The stock still mattered more than almost anything else. Yet generational time was doing what it always does. It was loosening obedience, multiplying personalities, and making the founder's demand for unity harder to enforce. Wealth can survive that for a while. Shared purpose often cannot. Jack seems to have recognized the danger, even if he could not solve it. Reporting years later in the Philadelphia Inquirer described a gathering at the Greenbrier in March of 1989, part family reunion and part corporate seminar, where the younger heirs toured operations, asked questions, and mixed with executives while Jack watched with cautious hope. The timing gives the scene its ache. 10 days later, on April 9, 1989, he suffered a fatal heart attack at his Gladwine home. The effort to prepare the next generation had barely begun before it was cut short. A man who had spent decades preserving control died just as the people meant to inherit that control were reaching middle age and thinking for themselves. His death did more than remove a chairman. It removed the last person in the family who still carried, however imperfectly, the founder's authority in human form. The structure remained. The stock remained. The will's logic remained. What vanished was the center that had made those things cohere. Within months, the underlying tensions that had been contained under Jack's stewardship began surfacing in public. Some heirs wanted liquidity. Some wanted continuity. Some wanted both, which is usually when dynasties get most dangerous to themselves. Ownership was still concentrated. Purpose no longer was. From that point forward, Campbell would be dealing with something more unstable than market competition or product strategy. It would be dealing with a family rich enough to control the company, and divided enough to imperil it. The family without a center. The dangerous moment in a dynasty is not always the death of the founder. Sometimes it comes later, when the rules are still there, the money is still there, the company is still there, and the one thing that has quietly vanished is the person everyone still expected to hold the center. That was the condition Campbell entered after Jack Dorrance died in April of 1989. The family still controlled nearly 60% of the stock. The will still cast its long shadow. The company was still too important to ignore. Yet, as the Philadelphia Inquirer later put it, the Dorrances had become a clan without a leader and a family without a shared purpose. That is a much more dangerous weakness than outsiders often realize. A company can survive disagreement. What it struggles to survive is disagreement inside the groups strong enough to control it. The family itself was no longer a single force moving in one direction. It was 9 cousins, 3 branches, old resentments, uneven levels of interest in the business, and radically different appetites for risk. Some saw Campbell as an heirloom that could not be sold without betraying the family's history. Others saw it as a concentrated financial asset sitting in one stock for far too long. That distinction matters because it changed the emotional meaning of the shares. To one side, the stock represented continuity. To the other, it represented confinement. What the will had once made look like discipline was beginning to look, from certain angles, like entrapment. Pressure had been building even before Jack's death. Through the middle of the 1980s, the food industry was thick with mergers and takeover activity, and Campbell's own results were no longer so strong that the family could simply point to performance and demand silence. The Inquirer's reconstruction of the period describes a family voting trust built in 1987 to keep the heirs' stock voting as a block, a measure meant to preserve family power just as doubts about management were intensifying. It also describes the internal split that followed. Family members who feared too much of their wealth was trapped in Campbell stock, and others who still treated sale talk as a kind of heresy. The trust had been built as a symbol of unity. Within a short time, it became proof that unity required engineering because it no longer came naturally. The ugliest expression of that instability arrived under the code name Project Toad. According to the Inquirer, a chance conversation on a ski trip in Vail helped lead to a secret merger plan involving Quaker Oats that would have created one of the largest food companies in the country. On paper, it was the kind of idea bankers love: scale, liquidity, a cleaner succession path, and more room for dissatisfied heirs to cash out without detonating the market for Campbell stock. In reality, it was dynamite. The plan would have reduced the Dorrances from majority owners of Campbell to minority holders in a larger corporation, and it carried the explosive possibility of moving the center of gravity away from Camden. To those family members already suspicious of management, it looked less like strategy than dispossession in a tailored suit. Project Toad did more than fail. It poisoned trust. The Inquirer describes how key family members learned that the merger had been pursued without their true consent and moved quickly to kill it. One faction had already begun thinking like dealmakers. Another was still thinking like custodians of an inheritance. The split became official when the Norrises, Hamiltons, and Van Burens ultimately announced that they wanted to sell their combined stake, roughly 17% of the company, and publicly called for the sale of Campbell itself. What had once been whispered inside a family now became a market signal. The company was suddenly exposed not just to food industry pressure, but to the spectacle of its controlling bloodline announcing, in effect, that control might be for sale. That crisis forced a decision the family could not postpone. They could not restore the old unity. What they could do was try to stabilize the company before the conflict consumed it. Campbell turned to David W. Johnson, an Australian-born executive who had built a reputation at Gerber and was elected president and chief executive officer in January of 1990. Company and industry histories later described his program in the blunt language it deserved: back to basics, drastic restructuring, divestitures, discipline. He closed and sold off weaker operations, simplified the portfolio, and brought a harder operational logic to a business that had drifted under the weight of family mistrust and strategic overreach. For a while it worked. Campbell itself later credited him with leading the company through the 1990s. Other business histories describe his early years as a period of significant restructuring and recovery. That partial recovery is what makes the family story here so unsettling. The immediate crisis passed. The company did not collapse. The dissidents did not instantly win. The center, for the moment, held. Yet the deeper fracture remained exactly where Jack had left it, inside the heirs themselves. They still owned the stock. They still mistrusted one another. They still carried the founder's command not to sell. Only now they had fresh proof that the command could split them as easily as bind them. Campbell had regained a chief executive. The family had not regained a center. Somewhere beyond Camden, one of Jack's children was already looking at the same fortune through a more radical lens. He had fought to keep the company in family hands. Before long, he would decide that keeping the wealth intact might require leaving something far larger behind. The man who left the country. The family had held the company. That was supposed to be the hard part. The real shock came afterward, when one of the heirs who had fought hardest to keep Campbell out of other hands decided the better way to protect his fortune was to leave the country that had made it possible. That turn matters because it reveals the final mutation of the Dorrance logic. John Thompson Dorrance had tried to manage taxation with a second residence. His grandson would answer the same pressure at a far greater scale. He would not juggle addresses. He would change citizenship. John T. Dorrance III, Ippy to those who knew the family, did not initially look like a man built for boardrooms. Public reporting and later profiles place him in the American West, on a large Wyoming ranch near Devil's Tower, living the life of a millionaire rancher more than that of a packaged food dynast. A UPI report in 1990 described him as fresh from the fight to keep Campbell in family hands and noted that he had joined other board members in an agreement blocking any sale or merger of the company. Even then, the tension was visible. He was deeply involved in protecting Campbell while living very far from Camden, both geographically and in temperament. The fortune was in New Jersey. The life he seemed to want was somewhere else. Inheritance changed the scale of everything. When Jack Dorrance died in 1989, the next generation did not merely receive dividends or trust distributions. They stepped into direct possession of a fortune whose value could no longer be discussed in the abstract. Forbes and later family profiles would describe John III as a major Campbell heir who eventually sold a stake worth hundreds of millions of dollars, while later reporting tied his name directly to the family's concentration of wealth and to the pressures that concentration created. That is the point where Campbell stopped being just a company to him, and became a tax problem large enough to shape the rest of his life. The family had seen this kind of pressure before. The grandfather had died and left behind a legal catastrophe because 2 states each claimed him. The son had spent decades preserving control over stock that could not easily be sold without weakening the family's power. By the early 1990s, John III was staring at another version of the same arithmetic. A public commentary from 1994 described the American estate tax reaching 55% on large fortunes, and contrasted it with Ireland's far lighter regime. That context matters because it helps explain why the family's old anxiety about death taxes did not fade after the double tax case. It merely changed form. Facing crushing tax disputes and corporate turmoil, a key heir and director tied to Campbell's eventually walked away from the company and from the country itself, exposing how fiscal pressures and mismanagement can hollow out an American icon and ruin lives. His answer was radical, but it was not irrational. Multiple later reports, including Irish and Forbes coverage, say Dorrance obtained Irish citizenship in 1995 after investing roughly $1.5 million in tree planting there. That was not a symbolic gesture. It was an exit route. Contemporary and later commentary repeatedly tied the move to the tax consequences of remaining American while holding a fortune of that size. A family member in an earlier generation had tried to manipulate domicile while keeping everything else in place. John III chose a cleaner, harsher method. He left. That decision was soon followed by the act that would have been unthinkable under the founder's will. Forbes records that he sold his Campbell stake in 1996, and public summaries of the transaction placed the value at roughly $720 million. The heir who had helped block a sale of the company in 1990 ended up cashing out his own portion of the dynasty only a few years later. The contradiction is the story. He had not abandoned the family cause at the moment of its greatest corporate danger. He had helped defend it. What he would not do was remain permanently trapped inside the tax consequences of defending it. The old command had been hold. His answer was protect what is mine and leave before the bill arrives. Washington noticed. Later legal and tax commentary would use Dorrance as a prominent example of the wealthy American who renounced citizenship to escape the reach of United States income and estate taxation. That is why his move echoed so loudly. It was not merely personal. It entered the political imagination as proof that at a certain scale, some fortunes would rather expatriate than submit. In another family, that might have read as pure opportunism. In the Dorrance line, it also read as inheritance in its most bitter form. The grandson had internalized the grandfather's fear of the taxman so completely that he did not just change states. He changed nations. That is why the story ends where it does. The kin remained American. The fortune did not stay fully so. Campbell survived. The family survived. The bloodline still held influence. Yet one of the men born to inherit the company's weight decided that carrying it to the grave on American terms was too expensive. The dynasty had begun with a chemist who removed water from soup to make it cheaper to move. It reached one of its strangest conclusions with a grandson who removed himself from the country to make the fortune cheaper to keep. The instinct was the same. Simplify the burden. Cut the cost. Preserve what can be preserved. The tragedy is that by then preservation no longer looked like loyalty. It looked like flight. The can is still there. Red on top, white on the bottom, steady on shelves that have outlived generations of the family that built it. What changed was everything behind it. A fortune engineered with precision, protected with control, and reshaped by fear of losing it. A dynasty that learned how to build, but never fully learned how to let go. If this story gave you a different way to see what looks permanent, stay with this kind of work. Like the video, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. Because sometimes the greatest cost is not what you lose, but what you have to become to keep it.